Last year, I can't remember when it was, but it was earlier last year, Adam was speaking with John Lawler about various research projects we might engage in, and he came back to the office and said, John Lawler was interested in knowing how recruitment takes place for organised crime groups. What do we know about it? Do you want to have a look in the literature and see what you can find? So a year or so later, I haven't been working on that solely for a year, but after a lot of research and piecing together everything from basic theories of how people commit crimes to the extensive literature on organised crime itself, I've put together a few observations on how recruitment takes place for people getting involved in organised crime. The argument is that if you can find out how people are recruited to become involved in these sort of activities, then you can intervene in various ways to prevent that recruitment from taking place, or to make it obvious that there's going to be some intervention by law enforcement which will make it an undesirable activity for people to undertake. Just by way of background and to put it in context, there's various criminological theories you can use to explore a research question like this, and a starting point, I guess, is Edwin Sutherland's work on differential association back in the 1940s. He looked at juvenile gang behaviour in Chicago and developed theories of how people get involved in juvenile gangs, how they justify their activities, how they learn to commit their offences. And he said that if the conditions favourable to acting illegally outweigh the frequency and intensity of conditions unfavourable to violating the law, then the individual is more likely to decide to break the law. So it's just a balancing up of costs and benefits from the criminal's point of view. He applied that theory in his study. It was a book called The Professional Thief in 1972. And he undertook some ethnographic research of the life and daily routines of professional thieves in the United States at the time. A bit later, in the 1970s, 1979, Lawrence Cohen and Marcus Felsen developed their well-known theory of routine activities in everyday life, and I won't go into the details of that, but that raises the triumvirate of factors that are present in committing crimes. You've got a motivated offender, a target, or an opportunity, and the absence of a capable guardian. And if you're able to reduce motivations, avoid targets, and enhance guardianship, then you're going to have some effect on reducing crime. And the third theoretical perspective that's probably relevant is Derek Cornish's work in 1994, in which he argued that crimes can be examined through the use of crime scripts, or a sequence of script functions and accompanying script actions that organise our knowledge and understanding of routine behavioural processes. So criminal behaviour, such as recruiting an individual to commit a crime, can be broken down to a number of routine processes. And what I've done in this paper is to scour the literature, and these references here are some of the books that I've used. There's many others that are relevant to this sort of work, but these ones had some good interview material with offenders that I made use of, to try and see what were the crime scripts involved in recruitment activities of organised crime groups. Dick Hobbs' book Lush Life is the most recent. He's Professor of Sociology at the University of Essex, and he wrote a book about his extensive experience of looking at East London crime gangs in an area that he called Dogtown. A lot of excellent research specifically looking at the recruitment processes by the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement at the Research and Documentation Centre at the Dutch Ministry of Security and Justice. And there's a number of academics there, Van Koppen, De Hurt and Clemens in particular, who've interviewed over 1,000 organised crime offenders and pieced together the way they carry out their activities. I won't go through the other books there, but they deal with again, interviewing organised criminals in different types of crime, everything from drug crime through to white-collar crime, serious and organised fraud, and the work that we did at the Institute on cybercrime. So, before we go any further, there's a warning that I need to give, and doing this sort of activity requires, and academics fall into this problem quite often, there's a desire to take the material that you're looking at and try and force it into an organised structure and develop some orderliness out of what you're dealing with. And in the organised crime world, it ain't all organised, unfortunately, and Dick Hobbs noted this in his book, and he said criminal collaborations generate chaotic sets of personal and commercial affiliations featuring fluid and often unpredictable interchanges that are ill-suited to the sociometric analysis favoured by police and police science. So if I'm trying to create nice, neat categories, that might sound good, but it probably is stretching the friendship on some occasions. Organised crime has got many different types. This is the definition from the UN that we're all familiar with. So you've got essentially 3 or more people involved in serious criminal activity. And you can arrange the sorts of organised crimes into a chart looking at their seriousness in one dimension and their impact in another dimension. That's my categorisation based on my reading. You might argue with how they stack up, but there's a lot of very low-level, small-scale activity, sometimes by juvenile street gangs, sometimes by family-based activities. Some of the mafia groups, for example, are really just family-based activities that they engage in. And then there's various forms of financial crime, some of it low level, and small businesses engage in tax fraud, for example. And then extending up through the more international areas such as, maritime piracy, environmental crime, some of the serious financial crime that can take place, right up to the more serious and high impact activities such as child exploitation, human trafficking, and so on. So looking at recruitment is going to differ slightly for those different types of activities, and the observations that I've got to make relate to some but not all of these types of crimes. So what are the pathways that we're looking at? The strategies involve identifying suitable targets, so other people who can become involved in criminal activity. And you can look at it from the perspective of both recruiters, so the people, organised crime groups who are seeking new members to become involved in activities, and also from recruitees' point of view. So they're largely law-abiding citizens who seem or want to become attracted and involved in the activities of organised crime groups. And I think that distinction is quite a nice way to separate the different factors involved. So you're looking for people who can be trusted, and trust is a key factor in this, and successful selection of people who've got necessary skills and who are cooperative, able to be coerced into acting illegally. So looking at the recruiters' pathways, we've got established crime groups who are looking at people who've got particular skill sets to assist with the activities. You might think about, manufacturing drugs or manufacturing counterfeit credit cards. Sometimes they might be engaged to help with acts of violence that the crime bosses don't want to undertake themselves personally. Laundering proceeds of crime is a clear example, and engaging in some high-risk activities such as using weapons or explosives, or some of the occasions where people are likely to get arrested and the organisers don't want to get arrested themselves. One example concerned a fellow we'll call Ron in his mid-50s. He'd been retired from his job in law enforcement for a decade when he first became involved in the drug trade. Ron managed an operation based upon couriers importing cocaine into the UK from Grenada. His role was to recruit and manage the couriers. He found them in a local casino where he spotted potential couriers from amongst the casino's clientele, tending to target white, middle-aged men low on money who needed a holiday. Ron made all the travel arrangements, purchased the airline tickets, provided a suitcase and handed over spending money. The couriers would have their holiday and return with an identical suitcase containing cocaine. It's obviously a high-risk activity for the couriers. On the successful arrival of a consignment in the UK, Ron would collect the cash from the courier at the airport, hand over the drugs to the bosses who were waiting in a nearby car park. The boss would pay Ron £12,000 in cash, which was £7,000 for the courier, who'd also had his 2-week holiday, and £5,000 for Ron. Now, turning to the recruitee pathways, as I said, these are largely non-criminals who are seeking participation in organised crime due to various life pressures that they're experiencing. So they invariably might be people who need money, they've got their own personal debts or lifestyle expenditure that they need to maintain. Some people who want to enhance their financial or social standing. And there's also a group of people who want to participate in risk-taking activities, some with pathological motivations. One example of that was Billy, a car dealer, successful car dealer and nightclub owner who'd also made money from an expanding property portfolio before he was introduced to a group of drug importers who were contemplating how to invest their profits. Attracted by the prospect of easy money, Billy fed these profits through his car dealership and progressed to become a middleman, seeking out buyers and importers. Eventually he ran the enterprise, became embroiled with the day-to-day workings of a large operation consisting of storers, mixers, testers and legitimate professionals, many of whom were paid a salary. Billy also courted the friendship of police officers who in exchange for free drinks would provide him with information and carry out background checks on business associates and employees. Now, how do you go about identifying willing people who you're going to become involved in? Firstly, there's the target of people who've acted illegally in the past. So these are people who've got some criminal history. They might be people who are skilled in some methodology that you're going to use, sometimes ex-military who've got experience with weapons and explosives, drug mules, as we've heard in this conference earlier, and sometimes young people who are willing to engage in pretty low-level activities for a dollar. You might also want to look to the legitimate workforce, lawyers, accountants, people in the IT industry, people in the security industry who can bring to bear their particular skills and expertise. Sometimes public sector employees, police, customs, intelligence officers, prison officers who can assist in the activities. And the criminal justice system itself is a great place to find willing accomplices. So prisoners, if you're in prison, you can speak with other prisoners and recruit them, and other recidivists that you're aware of. Good example was Carl, his real name, a former accountant who was serving a term of imprisonment for tax fraud in Western Australia. While in prison, he was approached by another prisoner who needed his assistance to obtain funds from the tax office. The accountant assisted him, but later found out that the claim wasn't legitimate. He was then approached by other prisoners who asked him to prepare false income tax returns with false business details and other fabricated evidence. Over a period of a year, he filed 210 false tax returns on behalf of 125 fellow prisoners. Nice little enterprise, in which he was claiming fraudulent tax refunds amounting to almost $1.3 million. A total of about $500,000 was refunded by the tax office to the prisoners, all in the same address, a certain detention centre. Carl administered the scheme using a computer for online banking and mobile phone. He received about $61,000 in commissions and fees over the 12-month period. As an argument in mitigation, he argued that he was forced to carry out the scheme against his will under duress, but was nonetheless sentenced to an additional 2 years with a further non-parole period of 12 months. Recruitees trying to identify organised crime groups that they can become involved with have probably got an easier task. If you want to become a member of the Yakuza and you want to find out who they are, they kindly sport tattoos which make identification simple. Some groups have common meeting places. We've heard previously in this conference about child exploitation groups who've got their own online clubs, often with complex and intricate procedures to become a member. And other groups with a public persona, and RMCGs are a good example of that, where they actually do the useful task of sporting their club colours so you know who you're dealing with. One example, Robbo, a biker who became a bikee, who had an early interest in motorcycles from a young age. He went to the Bathurst motorcycle races in the mid-70s and decided to become involved in some of the illegal activities. He says over the weekend he met many characters, some of whom were an integral part of his life as a biker. Robbo began to use his bike more and more, attending rallies, making friends in the biker world. He found himself drawn more and more into hanging out with the local outlaw club, Satan's Cavalry. His values began to change from biking as a lifestyle choice within straight society to living a life as a bikie and rejecting and simply not caring about the straight world. A biker cannot simply become a bikie. Most clubs have a long and arduous process of admission, and members must adhere to strict rules to maintain their membership. To become an outlaw motorcyclist can require years of scrutiny by fellow club members, impeccable credentials as a biker, and in certain circumstances having a requirement to commit an illegal act. And finally, what I've called maybe accidental or serendipitous recruitment. So people just hanging around in various places where they're going to meet up with likely customers. So pubs, casinos, gyms, health clubs, brothels, internet sites are all places where organised crime groups meet other people. The familial contacts, just targeting members of your own family group, often the case in some of the European organised crime groups. Forms of social media, networking, media publicity, which actually publicise the fact of willing accomplices who are needed, and sometimes opportunistic discovery of criminal connections. And one example of that was some of the research done in Holland. Brahim was a former truck driver who set up a cafe to be able to spend more time with his family. A group of customers recruited him to become involved in transporting heroin, and he said, you start talking and ask each other, what did you do before, where did you come from? That's the first thing you do. And when I mentioned I'd been a truck driver for years, that triggered something, of course. He should know people, maybe he wants to, but I never wanted to. I wasn't interested at all. I did not need the money, I did not buy it. It did not fascinate me. After some months, however, after all, they were your frequent customers and you talk to them all the time. There comes a time it goes through your mind that some others have the ability to and probably want to do it. First I thought, I'll do them both a favour, I can earn some additional money, I really did not see the danger in doing it. And he became more and more involved in the group and was eventually sentenced to 12 years for heroin trafficking. So the crime scripts, so what are the nuts and bolts of engaging in recruitment like this? Firstly, there's the signs of criminality, so the way to identify potential people. Look out for their visible skill sets, particularly they're going to be lawyers, IT workers, maybe people in the transport industry. A process of establishing trust, and this is where some of the initiation tasks come in. People have to submit child exploitation material libraries to prove their legitimacy to the group, maybe samples of criminality, acts of violence. That's verified over time to prove to the group that you're not going to be a risk, you're not an undercover law enforcement officer. Sometimes you'll partake in criminal operations to demonstrate your skill. Sometimes you'll serve prison time, again, as proof that you're legit. Compliance and reinforcement processes, so again, proof of your commitment to the activity, maybe investing financially or in other ways in the organisation. recruiting other people to become involved, and involving in an escalation of seriousness of criminal activity. Where recruitment fails, there'll be some form of detection. There may be sanctions about breaching rules. If there's evidence of whistleblowing or reporting to the authorities, that'll be noted, and then processes of increasingly severe sanctions, occasionally resulting in exclusion from the group, or even acts of violence and murder in some cases. Now, the methods can involve face-to-face contact, and they're quite obvious, particularly with ethnic and family groups, going to common locations. And Diego Gambetta wrote a great book a few years ago. He's a professor of sociology at Oxford, in which he analysed the non-verbal cues that organised crime groups when they're communicating with each other. And these are very important in again, testing out the veracity of people that you're dealing with. So it's a very good book to have a look at. Online recruitment, largely through membership of some of the dark places of the internet. Social networking can be a way of getting into that. Finding out information about public servants, perhaps getting people access to people's CVs. And occasionally, organised crime groups will advertise for people that they're willing to recruit. And this is a nice example that was from the crimeenforcers.com homepage, in which they were seeking willing participants to engage in card skimming activities. And I'll read this out for you. It's not my Queen's English that I'm speaking. We are a private organisation for your special developing requests. We are focused at electronic and computer engineering. If you need special hardwares, especially high-tech, nor software that cannot be done or even in your country because of any reason such as laws, etc., then you are at the very right place. We are offering absolutely anonymous and offshore developing for our projects. We don't care what you want to do with hardwares and softwares you requested to be done by us. Needless to say, your privacy is very important for us, and we don't share with anyone else because of any reason. We don't need your name, address, etc. because of any reason. We only need your email. You will have a certificate and account for secure login to our private forum for tracking your development, and even may ask questions to engineers who are engineering your project. If you reach this website, then you already know us. We are not cheap developers, and we can't make partnership with you. If you wish your dreams to come true, then you have to have enough money to invest for your dreams. You even have to pay for request for quote from us for your project. And again, a nice book to have a look at, the Dark Market, Cyber Thieves, Cyber Cops, and new book by Misha Glenny. And there's also an element of anonymity, how you protect your anonymity. And in the cyber session that we had yesterday, there was some very complex ways in which anonymity was used in the child exploitation world. So that's by way of what the problem is, and some observations now on how you might be able to use this information to try and interrupt some of these recruitment pathways. Firstly, in terms of the recruiter pathways, you can look at the skills element. So providing more intensive regulation of some of the skill-based sectors might prove beneficial, particularly in the world of banking, where you're creating cards, doing online banking activities. The transport industry is one that might need further regulation, and perhaps more attention on professionals, lawyers and accountants and others who might get involved in laundering. In terms of locations, monitoring some of these high-risk locations where people do regularly communicate and congregate together. So particularly prisons, obviously, pubs, gyms, areas like that. And in terms of detection, I think increasing the probability of detection is a very good deterrent. If people know that they're going to be deterred, then they're going to be much more careful and perhaps even not even engage in some of the high-risk activities involved in recruitment. Interrupting recruitee pathways. These are law-abiding citizens who are thinking of getting involved in organised crime, probably the best way is to look at their motivations for what they're doing. If you attack the motivations, look at some of the red flags of fraud, identify people who've got into financial trouble, either through gambling or other reasons, business failure or excessive lifestyle expenditure, then they're going to be things that you could look at which might ensure that those people don't seek out organised crime to raise funds for their own purposes. Neutralising the rationalisations that people use to justify activities. So if you can provide reasons why their rationalisations aren't valid, then people won't rely on them. And in terms of risk-taking, if you're trying to challenge some of the risk-taking motivations that people have for getting involved in organised crime, then you could give some positive publicity to the real life of organised crime. So show up the consequences of criminality, show how online activities can be monitored and the digital trails that you leave in cyberspace for people who might be recruited online that might deter them from using the internet for joining groups. Addressing the issues of anonymity, using convicted offender databases to facilitate identification, enhanced data analysis and financial intelligence, and location tracking where that's appropriate. And finally, changing the perceptions about organised crime. So trying to attack some of the publicity that's given in the community that organised crime is a nice thing to be involved in, when in fact it is really quite unattractive. It's often unprofitable. You can explain the risks of confiscation of assets, the way in which unexplained wealth laws operate, the problems of having your lifestyle disrupted, and all the physical harms, threats of violence and even death that go with becoming involved in organised crime. Often people don't realise that when they stumble into these worlds. And finally, just a few sort of policy areas that you could look at. Again, looking at professional regulation, making sure that's working properly. Data and network security, and particularly for people who are working in the IT industry, maybe looking at the way in which encryption's used illegally and trying to guard against that. We've got the anti-corruption measures coming through federally now with the national plan, which will be released shortly. And then encouraging reporting. If this sort of activity is made public, brought to the attention of the authorities in a reasonable way, maybe through the use of the key term system, where you've got effective protection of informants and maybe some financial reward going back to informants, that might be beneficial. Enhancing the collection and analysis of intelligence, so improving financial intelligence collection, improving prison security and the intelligence that's gathered within the prison environment, allowing data monitoring where that's appropriate and with judicial warrant, improving online identity verification, and that includes biometric information. If criminals realise that they are going to be identified and tracked and detected, then they're less likely to become involved. And finally, this area of attitudinal and motivational change, so publicising the financial and social impact of organised crime. Importantly, and this was mentioned yesterday, publicising the probability of detection so that people realise that there is going to be a chance that you'll be detected and dealt with. Publicising sentencing patterns, allowing people in the community to really know what the maximum penalties applicable to certain types of offences are. Publicising confiscation of assets regimes and unexplained wealth laws, and also the avenues for reporting and whistleblowing activities so that people can report simply and easily. So with Adam's simple task for me to unravel recruitment for organised crime, there's lots of material out there, and we're going to write this up into a paper over the next year or so, and that'll be available too. But I hope that's been of some interest. Thanks.